Gabrielle Burkhardt is back here in the KRQE News 13 digital studio here to talk about another investigation. Thanks for being here, Gabby.
Thanks for having me.
So this story, your latest investigation that just published just a day before we're recording this, this is about a handful of boxers who, as I understand, never got paid out after a recent fight night in Albuquerque. Is that about right?
Almost. Rio Rancho Event Center.
Okay,
yes,
okay. Albuquerque
February.
metro area, rather,
Yeah.
I should say, in that area. So,
correct.
Okay, so this was in February. A lot of people ended up without the money that they expected, is what it sounded like.
Yeah, fighter purses. Also, the winnings that the fighters are usually awarded after, winning a big fight like this. This is how a lot of them make their living. They train for this. They put on these big events that draw, big crowds. And yeah, this is basically their paycheck.
So let's take a look. Just if you have not seen this story online, you can watch it right now here on KRQE.com. This is what it looks like. It's called Albuquerque Fighters Handed Bad Checks After Tapia Fight Night. You've got a few web extras in here as well, some documents, as I understand, that are kind of central to this, right? So people should look for the links here under this a shouting match outside the ring part. You can see a couple of these things. What are the documents here, though, that people can also check into on this?
So these are police reports. The sort of behind-the-scenes scuffle that was going on were with Teresa Tapia, who, as many know her, is the widow to the late prize fighter Johnny Tapia, a well-known name here in the metro and just, in the fighting world in general. She co-promoted this event with a gentleman named Joe Kelly out of Kansas. And there were text messages, emails exchanged between the two of them talking about a partnership. They put on this fight, as I understood, together with an understanding that there would be some sort of 50-50 split cost to put on the event. Some of the fighters backed out before the event, and then that's where the stories sort of get a little bit conflicting.
Interesting. Okay.
But bottom line, yes, each of those promoters ended up filing police reports against one another. And through public records, we obtained those reports from the Rio Rancho Police Department. And my story sort of lays out both of their sides of the story.
Yeah, so once you get into this story, you can see those police reports, both of them online on KRQE.com. Within the body of the story, you'll see a couple links in there to check out. So let's get to how you started working on this story. How did this come about?
Well, a lot of our investigative type stories come from a tip. In this case, after the event, the fighters did go to cash their winnings, and the checks weren't cashing, which is obviously a big problem, especially when you're talking about, tens of thousands of dollars in some cases. So word kind of spread about this on social media. We've covered a lot of boxing with our sports guys. Van Tate, Jared, they cover a lot of sports. So Teresa Tapia actually reached out, wanted to get the full story across because she's like, look, I worked with this co-promoter, and then she started telling us about certain red flags that were happening, in her opinion, leading up to this fight, and how she claims, this co-promoter was the one who signed the checks, handed over the checks, which was true, and he admitted to as much. And in the end, it was the boxers that got stiffed because those checks were tied to a frozen account, as we learned, which was all true. But she wanted to be able to tell her side of the story as well.
Yeah. The question I had for you here, it may sound kind of goofy to some folks, but, is this type of thing typical? And the reason why I ask that is because you kind of realize that some of these events, it is people who are just coming together with their own bank accounts and, paying out fighters out of what may be personal checks sometimes. And so the point is that sometimes these types of things can happen because it isn't associated with these big, large apparatuses and businesses. So that's at least my thought. But I wanted to ask you, is it typical for something like this to happen? It really does not sound like it is.
No, and there's a commission here, an athletic commission here in New Mexico that has very, strict rules about how events are put on, and there has to be, somebody with a license on record, which in this case was Teresa Tapia, who put on the event. However, and she does explain to me in the story, and we can get into a little bit more about her reasoning, why there was no partnership written agreement to pay these fighter purses with Joe Kelly. She claims that for months, he had explained to her, look, I don't want my name on any contracts in New Mexico, because he was getting out of an ugly partnership, at least from what Teresa says that he told her. He was getting out of an ugly partnership, didn't want his name on anything. He was, telling her that he was at risk of losing things. So in her words, she's like, I believed him. And so, yeah, I put the license and everything was in my name. But she claims, he still had an agreement with her to pay a 50-50 split. So when it came down to it, the night of, she tells me that she chased him down essentially and said, hey, you need to pay these fighters. And he's like, I'm not paying all the fighter purses. And they got into a shouting match that several people did witness. There were authorities on hand. They took statements from each party. And that's what our story sort of lines out. But to answer your question, it does not seem typical that, people are just totally stiffed like this at an event this large.
Yeah.
There are laws in place to protect fighters, because historically there are incidences where fighters, have been historically taken advantage of.
Yeah.
By whether that be promoters, managers. It's a lot of cash to think about. Like one fighter, I think in this case, won at least 10 grand.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of money for some of these young kids. And when you have big purses and big winnings like that, it's really important to have, rules, measures in place to protect your assets, to protect yourself in situations like this. And signed contracts is one of the ways that you can do that.
Yeah, and I think I should have added this as a caveat, is that when you think of the workplace, you do your work and you get paid for it afterwards, sometimes, waiting for a certain number of days to receive your paycheck. And that's kind of one of the thoughts that I had, is that, is it typical for these kinds of checks to be cut that night, and for that payout to happen immediately? And from what it sounds like you've presented, it is a typical thing that should have happened. But as we know from what you outlined in your story, those checks pretty quickly, there were some problems that arose from that. I wanted to ask you as well in your story, because one thing's missing, right? We're not hearing from any of the fighters, but it was not for a lack of trying, right? Did you try to speak to or end up speaking to some of these fighters who maybe were not interviewed?
Yes, I did actually, at least over the phone for sure. And I did confirm with some of them that they did try to cash these checks and that they bounced. And, I think there was some frustration there. When it came down to interviewing on camera, though, that's when, honestly, my phone calls stopped getting returns. And that could be for whatever personal reasons that I can't speculate about. I can't fully put myself in their shoes, going through the training, putting themselves through the ringer, no pun intended, but literally, and then just, not getting what was owed to you. But I will say, Teresa Tapia did make it clear to me. She did, give me some documentation as well. And she says, I don't want to be in the business of screwing over fighters. So she is making good faith payments to those fighters who tried to cash those bad checks, is what she says. And she also tells me that she intends on filing a lawsuit against Joe Kelly, which we can get into as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a good measure to kind of go to next. You did try to speak to Joe Kelly. There's a moment in your story, I believe you're on the phone, and it sounds like there was no connection made there. The story has since aired. Have you heard anything back from either side here since the story's aired?
No, I had a few email addresses for him as well. His website doesn't appear to be working at last check. And then I also called him from cell phone numbers that I got through public records and from. He never returned my calls, didn't email me, but I was able to include his version of events through statements that he made with Rio Rancho Police. So, through again public records, we obtained the police report that he filed and also his lapel video telling the story about how He claims he was being extorted, being threatened into writing those checks, and then he outwardly admits to the police, I froze that account to the checks that I wrote, and then he provided them copies with all the checks, which amounted to, a total of more than $40,000 in worthless checks that he admitted to writing.
Yeah.
But also of note, Rio Rancho police, noted in each of their police reports that this does seem like a civil matter, that it didn't appear that they were going to file any criminal charges for this case.
So one of the questions, it sounds like, that has come up with this story since it aired is this, question about the signed contract, right? I know Teresa Tapia talks a little bit about that in your story, but there was no signed contract in this case, and there seemingly was a reason why. I think, though, people have asked, why not sign a contract if you want all parties to kind of agree to a set of terms here?
That was one of the first things she told me over the phone, was that this was a tough lesson for her to have learned. This is Teresa telling me her side of the story, which is that she's always promoted events on her own and not ever worked with Joe Kelly in the past or co-promoted an event like this. So she says, I learned that lesson and I should have gotten a signed contract. But again, her explanation for why there wasn't one in this specific case was that she says Joe Kelly told her basically this whole story about why he didn't want his name on any paperwork, that he was getting out of an ugly partnership, and he stood to lose, his home, certain things. So she said, I agreed to put it all under my license and my name, but when it came down to it, she tells me again, he still agreed to a 50-50 split. So she was going to hold him to it, it sounds like, and told him the night of the event, you need to pay these fighters. So he did end up writing checks and then admittedly froze his account shortly thereafter. So none of those fighters were able to cash those checks, which is the bottom line to this story, is that the fighters are the ones who really lost here as well.
Of note, you mentioned, I think this a little bit earlier in our conversation, there's been an attempt at payments. Unclear, it sounds like, of whether or not those payments have been entirely made for what the purse was, but obviously, as Teresa Tapia has outlined, she never went into this whole thing, as she says, intending to make, the full payments, so to speak. So one last question I had for you, Gabby, was what is next? It kind of sounds like a civil matter. Could that possibly be where this is going?
Yes, for sure. And I have seen a drafted version of the lawsuit that Teresa Tapia intends to file against Joe Kelly for misrepresentation, fraud, breach of contract, so a breach of negotiations. There are, some wording things that could change in that before it's filed within the courts, but it seems like this could play out in a civil court potentially. And, according to Teresa Tapia, she's, I believe, still making some good faith payments to those fighters who are still owed their winnings. But as a lot of people know, she's local, and I'm sure they have, the Tapia Boxing Academy. So her words again, and you can watch her side of the story in my story here online on KRQE.com. But she says, she's not in the business to screw over fighters. So, yeah.
Well, interesting. We appreciate you bringing us this story here on KRQE and KRQE.com. If you want to check it out as well, you can also check out KRQE.com/investigations for this story and all of Gabby and her colleague Ann Perret's work. Gabby, where's a good way that maybe people can reach you if they have a question, comment, story idea, whatever?
Yeah, definitely via email. That way I can, retrace some notes in my inbox. Gabrielle.burkhart@krqe.com is my email.
Okay. Gabby, thanks again.
Thank you.